Richard?
Yes, sir. Not my water. Don't go there.
It's working.
There he is.
Apologies for the delay. It had something to do with an Uber driver. But we won't get there because he's finally sort of settled down. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's my real honor to welcome an old friend and long-time council visitor and spokesperson, Richard Haass, the President of the Council on Foreign Relations. We'll be on the record today. We're both live streaming and recording. Let me just emphasize that the views you hear here are those of the speaker and not of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
I'm actually happy to speak for the Chicago Council.
Yeah, no, I know. That's why we're saying this to make it clear. We'll have a short conversation and then we'll open the floor for your questions. We can take that conversation anywhere you want. For those who are here in person, we have mics running around, so just make yourself known if you want to be recognized, and we'll recognize you. And for those who are joining us online, you can submit a question by directing your browser to ccga.live, type in a question, or even vote for a question that's there, and we'll get to that as well. Following the program, Richard will be signing the copies of his new book, the Bill of Obligations, 10 Habits of Good Citizens. Copies of the book will be available for purchase through the bookseller. But let's begin. First of all, let me, again, thank you for coming, Richard. We've known each other for a very long time. I even worked for you for a while. It was great.
It's when Ivo's hair turned color.
It was that and no, yeah, it was only that actually, but I still have some.
Ooh.
Richard is
Wow, ugly fast.
hard crowd here. As you all know, Richard's president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and educational institution. He's an experienced diplomat and policymaker. He served in the Department of State, including as Director of Policy Planning. He was in the White House, including as Senior Director for Middle East Policy during the Gulf War, the good war, or at least not the good war, the necessary war. And he has worked for Secretary of State Colin Powell on a whole range of foreign policy issues. He's the author of too many books. I am incredibly envious that you find the time to write them, but I'm even more envious that you write such great books. So
thank you.
Please join me in welcoming Richard Haass here at the Council today.
Actually, I'll say one thing about that. Thank you, Ivo. Probably the most useful thing I'm going to say while I'm here today is my recommendation for everyone is they make a pledge and they ban and avoid working breakfasts. Because in that moment of those few hours of the day where you would otherwise be at breakfast, that is your time for doing your best thinking and reading and writing. So that is probably the most useful recommendation I will make here.
So that's after Morning Joe and before work. So
it's a window.
You know, so you need to just make sure that Morning Joe fits in there. No, but actually the recommendation of figuring out what 2 hours or whatever you're going to devote to that and not have that interfere is a good one. When I was at NATO, I never had working lunches. Total waste of time. Long, and it takes a long time. So I agree with you completely. Let's talk about your new book, because it's really, I mean, all of your books are great, but this is, I think, is a work of, not love is the wrong word, but it's something that you've been thinking about for a very, very long time. It's not a memoir, it's actually a call to arms. It's about the biggest danger that you see out in the world, which is not out there for someone who has spent his entire life thinking about what's out there, but down here. Why? What is it that really bothers you, and why is it so important that we start facing this in the way that you think we should?
Again, thank you. It's not so much a call to arms, though it is. It's really a call for national conversation. And I didn't set out to do this years ago. What triggered it was groups like this, and knowing I'm a foreign policy guy, as is Ivo, and the conversation, at some point, somebody would ask a question afterwards and say, okay, you've talked about China and Russia and Iran and North Korea or climate change. What keeps you up at night? And I increasingly said, oh, that's easy, it's us. And I'm worried that increasingly we won't have the unity, the focus, the bandwidth, the resources, the predictability, the reliability to be an effective actor in the world. And what the last 3/4 of a century show is that an effective United States can have, and has had, an outside, largely constructive impact on the world. And without that, I worry about the world, and as a result, I worry about us. And for the first time, I couldn't take us for granted. So I started thinking hard years ago about what was wrong. And I reread a lot of material, or in some cases read for the first time material about us, and just thought long and hard about what seemed to be missing. And when you read a lot of the work of the founders and the rest, they spoke. There's almost no mention of obligations. And the more I thought about it, was because they assumed it. They wrote about virtue. They wrote about character. And this was a moment soon after independence where they weren't worried about people's commitment to one another or to the new country. But over the last 2.5 centuries, that has, shall we say, attenuated. And the citizenship, there's got to be a balance or two dimensions in citizenship. I like the image of a coin. One side is rights, and the other side is obligations. And no one should get me wrong. Rights are central to the American experience. We would not have had a constitution were it not for the Bill of Rights. That was the condition several states set for their ratification of the proposed new or second constitution after the Articles. And if you think about our history, through Lincoln's phrasing and framing of our unfinished work, a lot of the last, again, 2.5 centuries can be understood is narrowing the gap between our principles and our practices in the realm of rights. And I think the good news is we have, in many cases, narrowed the gap. It took a civil war, took several amendments to the Constitution, above all the 14th, took civil rights legislation, extending the right to vote to women, to 18-year-olds, and so forth. But we have made enormous progress. But the more I thought about it, and Steve Breyer had an impact on my thinking here, former Justice of the Supreme Court, is that even if Lincoln's work could somehow be magically finished, and there was no longer a gap between our principles and our practices and rights, even then American democracy would be in trouble. I mean, look at the big debates now. A woman's or mother's right to choose versus the rights of the unborn. Someone's right to bear arms pursuant to the Second Amendment versus rights to public safety. Someone's right not to get vaccinated or wear a mask versus public health. Well, how do you navigate that? How do you deal with rights versus rights as opposed to rights versus wrongs? And that's what ultimately led me. I did a lot of thinking during the early months of the pandemic about how does one restore something of a balance into our notion of citizenship. And again, it's not that rights aren't important. It's just that they're, to use the old social science construct, they're necessary but not sufficient.
So how does obligation help? How does it help to think about people having obligations, and how do you get people to adhere to those obligations?
Again, obligations are things you should do or ought to do, unlike law, which you're required to do. And we have the law. And what we're seeing, though, in American politics is adherence to the law, again, as important as it is not adequate. It's not sufficient. All sorts of other things matter. Think about the peaceful transfer of power, the norm, that wonderful moment traditionally in American politics where the outgoing, sometimes defeated president travels in a limousine down the avenue from the White House to Pennsylvania Avenue to Capitol Hill with the person who just defeated him. And what better way is there to symbolize the primacy of democracy? And again, the peaceful transfer, that the transfer is bigger than any policy difference or any difference among persons. But that sort of process is not required by law. You won't read about it in the Constitution or anywhere else. People, the first of the obligations, things like is to get informed. Well, again, there's no constitutional requirement that citizens be informed. Jefferson talked about its importance, but it's just that it's important to vote, to be involved politically. Again, we're not Australia. You don't have to show up at the polling station here. We can argue whether we ought to be or not. I don't think it's a good idea. But again, it's not something that's mandatory. It's simply desirable. And I could get a teaching of civics, opportunities for public service, a commitment to put the country before personal or party interest. None of those things can be legislated or required by law, and if you don't do those, you get fined or jailed. It's simply the things that ought to be done in order to make our politics work. So that's why I think it's so important. Simply adherence to the law is too narrow, it's too pinched. Democracy cannot work that way. We're going to have a big test in the next couple of weeks on debt ceiling. Simple adherence to the law is not going to get us over the line or avoid us going over the cliff. It's going to take an openness to compromise and so forth. Well, that can't be a matter of law. So to make democracy essentially work and deliver, and if it doesn't deliver, then we are in serious trouble, from the resource shortages to feeding populism in this country. There's got to be a commitment to obligations. How we get there, we can talk about it, but again, there's no single answer. It's not top down. The more I thought about it, everyone in this room is part of it. Everyone in this room has obligations to one another. Ivo and I have them to one another. You all have them, and we all have them to this country, to the government, to authority, and to this country. But it's almost a distribution or a decentralization of effort. Teachers have certain obligations, journalists do, business leaders do, parents do, religious authority, congregational leaders do. It takes the cumulative efforts of all these individuals in our society to get us to where we want to go. It will not and cannot be delivered from above by politicians. To the contrary, the politicians will only start doing the right thing when we incentivize them to do it by rewarding good behavior and penalizing bad behavior.
So let's talk about some of these obligations that you have. One, you mentioned be informed.
Yep.
You and I are in the business of helping to inform people about what's happening abroad and why it matters and how they should think about it. And in some ways, we're living in a time when it has never been easier to be informed. There's more information. It is more easily accessible than it has ever been. And it's also, at the same time, more difficult to be informed than at any time, because a lot of the information that's out there is contestable, sometimes wrong and misinformed. How does a citizen guide themselves through this morass of having too much information? How do they know what is the right kinds of information and what's the wrong kind of information?
Yeah, I mean, you put your finger on one of the contradictions of the moment. There's easier access to more information than ever in human history, but that's also the problem. And often telling or distinguishing between information and misinformation, facts and things that are purported or portraying themselves as facts that are not. So it turns out to be a really complicated information space. The analogy I increasingly use is, with our information systems at work, we have certain rules that's often called, cyber hygiene or computer hygiene. Like, your password probably should not be 1234. Just saying. If you happen to see a little, drive in the parking lot, you probably shouldn't plug it into your computer. When you get those funny emails about banks in Nigeria, you probably shouldn't send them all your banking information. Okay, so that's hygiene, and that's how we've learned to reduce our vulnerability to certain. Well, we ought to have the same things with information. We ought to have, if you will, what constitutes information literacy. One thing would be to multi-source information rather than to put all your weight. If you had a diagnosis from a doctor that was somewhat significant, you'd probably get a second opinion. Why not get a second source of information when it deals with political life? That would be one thing. Another thing we could do in the realm of is teaching people what are different kinds of places. Do places have editors? Fact checkers. Some places do, some places don't. Do they have opinion pages as opposed to news pages, or the equivalent of, if they're not paper? Things like that. New Jersey has recently instituted a mandate, a public school requirement that students learn information literacy. Doesn't teach them what to think. What it teaches them is how to be critical consumers of information. Well, Illinois should do that. This should be part, I would say, of every middle school or high school education. I think it ought to be part of a civics curriculum, something else I expect we'll talk about. But exactly for the reasons you mentioned, Ivo, that we're swimming in information, it ought to help people get better at discerning what is a fact as opposed to a prediction, as opposed to an opinion. One thing is to be very wary of social media. Big hint, spoiler alert. It's called social media. It's not called serious media. It's not called scientific media. It's not called fact-laden media. It's called social media. So go there for social stuff, but probably don't go there for your principal information base. So these are the kinds of things that we can teach. So I think there are best practices, if you will, at helping people navigate this sea of information and misinformation we find ourselves swimming in.
So you mean blue check mark doesn't mean it's true?
I hate to burst your bubble.
Yeah, all right. Because I thought that was how it really worked, right?
Yes, sir.
You mentioned civics, so let's talk about civics, because it's remarkable how not only people are not necessarily well informed, but how people don't know how government works, how our system works, and how can we have an informed citizenry? In fact, how can we meet many of the obligations you lay out without having a sense of how things work? And what do we do about it?
It's not just how things work, it's how we got to where we are. It's why it's valuable.
Yep.
So it's what is a democracy? What does it take to operate? What's the case for it? Why? What's the strengths of it? What's the weaknesses? What are the things that are expected of citizens in a democracy? What can they expect in return? What are the rights? What are the obligations? Well, nobody's born with that. Why would anybody simply know that? It's not in your cells to know that. And so my view is that it's got to be taught, and we can't expect it. The media is not going to provide it. Many parents aren't in a position where, so that's the one thing everybody does pretty much in this country is they go to school through the age of 16. Many go beyond that to the age of 18. Many go beyond that to 2 or 4 year college and university educations. The analogy that I thought of when I wrote the book, actually, funnily enough, it was in the first draft, it was the beginning of the book, and then I moved it into the civics chapter, was the Jewish holiday of Passover. Jews have spent several thousand years often facing persecution, often scattered around the world. The state of Israel only came into existence in 1948. And so the most basic holiday in many ways for Jews is Passover, because it tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And the entire holiday takes place around the meal. Everything is done in a certain order, certain symbols. It's a teaching holiday. And there literally is a book that's called, the translation is The Telling, and you tell the narrative of the Jewish people. And there's an obligation of generation to generation to pass this on, because it is not assumed that younger generations automatically know it, but it's thought that it's essential that they know it if they're going to keep their identity. And I think that's a really good analogy for Americans. We shouldn't assume that younger generations are born knowing it, but we should assume it's necessary they're taught it if we're going to keep this thing called America, this experiment, going. And so that's what civics education ought to do. It ought to be something, and I believe in our schools, and I would make it mandatory. Not a lot I would make mandatory. This I'd make mandatory. I would make it mandatory that you could not get a high school degree without it, and you could not get a college degree. We have about 4,000 plus or minus colleges and universities in this country. Virtually all of them offer something that's adjacent to or covers a lot of stuff that I would say ought to constitute a civics curriculum. Virtually none of these schools, less than like 1 or 2%, required as a condition of graduation. You can navigate your distribution requirements and such, and you might have to take 2 courses out of 50 in the area of history and politics. Okay, well, that gives you, shall we say, a lot of latitude to graduate illiterate when it comes to American civics. A lot of high schools don't teach it. If they teach it, it's 1 semester. It's really poorly taught. Teachers aren't trained. There's no standard curriculum. The idea that there's no consistent curriculum in the various states kind of defeat, again, that's the whole idea. We want to maintain a national consciousness, a national identity. We're not doing it. So I'm leaving my job in 2 more months after 20 years of being at the council. One of the things I'm going to devote myself to is this, is developing a national curriculum for high schools and colleges and then promoting its adoption. So future generations, thank you. And I'm going to give you all a chance to support it down the road. But this is an important thing. I just think this is one of the things we have got to get right. And several years ago we said, well, we've got to do more to teach our kids STEM in schools. Okay, well, I'm not against STEM. I want our kids to be literate in that. And we don't want any young person to graduate a high school who can't read and think critically and write and speak and so forth. But I would think preparing people for citizenship in a democracy ought to be a pretty high priority, and we're not doing it, and that canon should be fixed.
Amen to that. It is important, and our education system is the core of democracy, which sort of leads me to talk about the next generation, and sort of the advice you might have for them, not only how we should teach them, but public service is important.
Sure.
How do we encourage the next generation to continue to be part of public service? How should they think about public service? Is it just, I'm going to be a foreign service officer, I'm going to go in the military, I'm going to work in the need to think about what one does, and not only in terms of what it gets in immediate gratification for oneself, but how one helps that in a larger context?
Well, I think teaching civics would help if one talks about the importance and the value of democracy. But I think we can make public service attractive. We ought to incentivize it. Pay people to do it. Pay them a decent salary. Train them up along the way, in addition. It would be great if colleges gave preferential admissions to young people who had maybe spent a year or 2 as a gap between high school and college doing public service. Just like employers, many employers are more likely to hire veterans. The same sort of thing could happen with people who had done public service. California, the state to your west, is piloting, I think, 4 separate public service programs right now, but Maryland is looking into doing similar things, so why not? And what's so good about public service, I think it's multiple benefits. It breaks down some of the divide between individuals and the government. It brings people together who would never otherwise meet. When you read people like Tom Brokaw and The Greatest Generation, all that, you go back to the World War II stuff, one of the good things about the draft is people with totally different levels of educational attainment, geography, religion, country of origin, color, gender, whatever, would come together. Right now, we don't have that. We have way too much separateness in America and dissimilar experiences. People are more likely to spend their time on their device with this or that chat group or something than they are with meeting people, other Americans. And public service could change that. So I think we have to come up with the resources. We have to come up with programs that the society needs. But I think this is a really valuable thing that should be. I wouldn't mandate it because I'm not big on mandating things. For the most part, because I think they'd be pushed back against it. But I think we should incentivize it, and my guess is a lot of Americans would do it if we made it an attractive experience, and I think there'll be multiple payoffs.
Remind people, I'm going to come to you in a minute on the floor, and if you have a question when you're joining us online, go to ccga.live and type in your question there, and we'll get to it. We do polling at the council, as you know. We've been doing it for almost 50 years. It is turning out that Gen Z and millennials, actually not surprisingly, but are increasingly distrustful of the kind of institutions and the kind of policies that you and I grew up with. Don't really believe in global engagement and global leadership. It's not the kind of terminology they use, are very wary about military, the use of military force in foreign policy, certainly compared to other generations. There's good reasons for it, given the last 20, 30 years in our history, but how concerned should we be about this? How are we concerned that we are seeing the emergence not just of a political divide, which has been around for a while, but really now a generational divide about how should America behave in the world, what are its obligations and its leadership demands that is different. You and my generation look at that as sort of a given, but the next generation, our kids, don't look at it in those ways.
In some ways, I understand why they don't. If you're 40 years old, 35, 40 years old, and you look at, you've been, say, politically aware for 20 odd years. So you had 9/11. You then had the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. You've had the pandemic. You had the 2007-8 financial crisis. You've had the more recent problems with inflation and a lack of supervision of financial institutions. You had January 6th. So you look at all this and you go, what's so hot about democracy? And so I understand why there's alienation, disillusionment, and you see in the polls that people don't see the inherent or innate attractiveness or advantages of democracy. So I get it. We had the other day, Prime Minister Trudeau came to the council. He and I had a conversation like this. And you know, his whole argument was that democracies have to deliver. And if they don't deliver, people will start shopping around for alternatives. And it could be the alternative of populism, it could be the alternative of illiberalism. And I think that's true. So part of my answer to that is we've got to do better. And elites just have to do better. And I think the last couple of decades have been a really, by and large, disappointing era of American performance. There have been exceptions. I think things like PEPFARs was a fantastic program. I think the essence of what we're doing now in Ukraine is essentially right. So we're doing some things right. Don't get me wrong. But we've made way too many mistakes. But I think then is again, it's to remind people of history, civic, and when it's wrong, what we want people, the message should be, when government comes up short, the answer is not to give up on it, but I want, to use an old phrase, we want the best and brightest to join. And when you and I came of age, I'm a little bit older than you, but when we came of age, government was a really attractive career choice. And the idea of being an academic and being in government, some kind of an in and outer, was a really attractive. And almost even people who took other careers like law, whatever, again, they were thinking that they would spend a big chunk of their time in government. It was exciting, it was important, it was interesting, it was satisfying, and all those things. And I worry that the best and brightest aren't doing all that, so we've got to make it attractive. So I think that's on us. That's on the, you got two members of the establishment up here, but I think it's on us to make it attractive and to basically also appeal to people's self-interest, which is government, whether you like it or not, is really important. I don't have a lot of time and patience for expressions like the deep state and all that. Government is us. Tens of millions of people work in government. I get frustrated when people denounce the quote-unquote deep state, and then they wonder where their Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security check is. Government is us. Security, stability, economically, physically, that's what government is meant to do. I want to make it better. So we want our, yes, it's good that some of our best and brightest go into, I guess, Silicon Valley or financial engineering, but I want more of them to go into government.
Let me open it up for questions. There are a lot of them. Microphones are being run around. We're going to start all the way in the back. There we go. And if you just tell us who you are, and comments welcome, but end with a question.
Hello, my name is Stephen Waller. Thank you for joining us tonight. My question is relative to the engagement. How do you think about the mechanics of how the system works, gerrymandering, the electoral college, as it relates to not reflecting citizens' engagement and the will?
I understand all the critiques of our current system, and almost all of them, I would say, have more than a little substance to them. Gerrymandering, we have in many cases what you might call minoritarianism in this country, where minorities have in some ways outsized impact given the way we construct the electoral college, given the way we construct the Senate. I understand the frustrations with how we finance I get it. So let me tell you where I come out though. And it's the same, the analogy that got me there was one that's a foreign policy one, which is the UN Security Council. So we have a UN Security Council with 5 permanent members: United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France. There is zero chance on God's green earth, if we were designing a UN Security Council now, that we would design this one. With these 5 countries having vetoes and being permanent members, as opposed to some other countries being there, maybe some of these not. But you can't change it, because any proposed change would disadvantage certain countries as they see it. And shockingly enough, it's good you're sitting down, those who feel they would be disadvantaged by reform will resist it or defeat it. So, coming back to your question, there's a lot of things we could do to improve American politics and to make it more consistent with one person, one vote, more represented. The problem is that virtually all of those reforms will go nowhere, not because they're not desirable, but because politically they will be stopped. Because the current system advantages certain individuals or groups and disadvantages others. That's why I wrote the book. It's not that I don't think those reforms, again, would be healthy or helpful if they were adopted, but they're not going to be adopted. So to simply come out with another report or book saying we ought to fix gerrymandering and do this and this, okay, but that ain't going to happen. So what I think is interesting is to focus on things that could happen. And the stuff I'm writing about could happen, which would be desirable in and of themselves. And if they were to happen, I think it actually increases the likelihood we could create a political context in which some of the things you've just put your finger on have a better chance of happening. We just can't get directly from where we are to there. It's too big of a political leap. We've got to change the political environment or context, and that's where the obligations come in, and that's where, again, I look to those who have particular authority or influence in our society, from journalists to the clergy, to teachers, to CEOs, to parents, what have you. They have got to understand their role in contributing to American democracy.
Very interesting. I like this idea that there's a pathway that goes through figuring out how we go back to some kind of normative obligation thinking that then leads you to that change. You need the kind of changes that we had before were possible because we lived in those kinds of societies.
We made lots of changes historically,
right,
because there was a greater sense of obligation and commitment to the whole. Now we can't. And by the way, we've stopped making a lot of changes to our system.
Right.
We've had 27 amendments, only 17 after the first 10 in nearly 2.5 centuries. Now, we made it hard to change things. We maybe didn't make it this hard. And also the country, when we were founded as a republic, 3 million people. We're now 333, 340 million people. We're 13 states, 50 states, and the district. A lot of things have changed, but our politics haven't kept up with them. And again, the point is, the politics, again, are not in a position, like they used to be, to adapt. We're not nearly as, there's entire literature about how democracies and mature political systems, almost like the rest of us, I'm old enough I can say it now, get hardening of the arteries. That democracies and political systems get a bit sclerotic. Special interests often take root at the expense of general interest, and that's what we're seeing in America. And I don't know how to change that directly, hence an effort to change it, at least initially, indirectly.
Let's go over here, third row. Gentlemen, yeah.
Thank you. We are either on the cusp of or in the middle of a revolution called artificial intelligence. And I wonder if you could comment both on the potential good that can come of that, but also the immense dangers.
Yeah, happy to comment that I have a general view of technology, which is technology tends to be neither good nor bad, benign or malign, but tends to often be both. So there are aspects of artificial intelligence which are just wonderful. The ability to read CAT scans and MRIs and the rest is really quite extraordinary. Anytime you can have to examine a mass of data and you want to notice patterns but also deviations from patterns, it's fantastic. You know, have ChatGPT, which actually takes it a qualitative step further with the ability to originate certain things. Nuclear technologies in decades past, one of the reasons the Cold War stayed cold was because of nuclear weapons. My point is simply that technologies, depending upon who's using them and how they're used, can be forces for ill or forces for good, and at one and the same time, often both. So that's how I tend to think of things like AI, quantum computing, advances in biotech. I think there's benign and malign aspects. I'm not wildly, the only area I get really pessimistic in, and if you remember a few days ago, Mr. Musk, when he wasn't busy having the value of Twitter, he came out with the idea there ought to be a 6-month pause on ChatGPT, I think it was, or AI, or both. And that's not going to happen. We don't have the regulatory frameworks nationally or internationally to do that. So I don't think there's going to be a political answer to a lot of the new technologies. I think there's going to more likely have to be a technological answer to it, that there's, just like with ChatGPT, can make it too easy for students to turn to that to produce their essays. Well, we may have to have other uses of AI that can detect the use of ChatGPT in essays. So my guess is it's going to be that kind of a thing. And but I don't think there's a political solution. But what I worry about is the pace of innovation now is so fast, and the scale of innovation is so immense, it's clearly going to go far, far quicker than our politics can respond. Think about the legislative cycle and what a company like what OpenAI is doing in a matter of weeks or months. We can't, I worry. I mean, we're having enough trouble with our democracy short of that. I worry that this potentially adds to the potential for fakes, for in the video space, information. It'll get harder to detect who's saying what and what's real. I think it will add a layer of complication. That said, I think some of our most fundamental challenges are still more fundamental than that. But this all has the potential, I think, to probably make it more difficult. Though usually technologies also, the same technologies that cause problems, they can be used in different ways to at least offer partial remedies. But we're still early in all this, and I've just told you more than I know about the subject.
Just to, since we're on the record, ChatGPT didn't write your book, right?
Yeah, no, I used it though. I was asked to give one of the eulogies to Ash Carter. Ash was the Secretary of Defense. So when I prepared it, I went to ChatGPT. This is a few months ago, just when it was breaking, and I wrote in Ash Carter eulogy and all that, and it came out with this language. It was kind of like, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here." So I read it as the first paragraph in my eulogy, and then I stopped. It was in the National Cathedral. I apologized to the president. I apologized to Ash's wife, Stephanie. I said, "That wasn't me. That was ChatGPT." And I used it because one, Ash was uniquely gifted in the area of understanding technology. He was a scientist and a political scientist. someone who bridged the two worlds. Basically, we used to call him bilingual. And I said, one, he could have explained it to everybody, and two, he would have laughed at it. And then I went and gave my thing. But it was interesting. One or two people afterwards came up to me and said, it sounded a little bit stilted. It didn't sound like your prose. Now, what I didn't know at the time, I could have typed in eulogy for Ash Carter in the style of Richard Haass, and I probably could have done something that people, but I haven't tried that. But no, this book was written before chat.
That's good. I just wanted to get it on the record because, you never know these days anymore.
You never know these. That you can know. You can take that to the bank. Like if you say you can't say anything, you take it to the bank because the bank may no longer exist. That's.
I take the lady here on the aisle.
My name is Mina Skau. I'm a Danish journalist. I just moved back to the US 2 months ago. I was in New York from 2004 till 2011. Then I've been in Brussels and Copenhagen in between.
So since you were in New York, are you pulling for the Knicks tonight or what?
Already when I was here, when I was here then, I observed that this country was very tribal. You're always either or. You say government is us. I would challenge it and say government is always either us or them. Mm-hmm. There's no meeting place in the media. There's never or rarely a debate. There's always either them or us having an opinion. Even when I call academics to get expert opinion, they declare they're either one or the other. Is there a need for a fix of that?
Absolutely. No, you're right.
And how?
Your word tribal is not too strong. And I think social media reinforces it because people tend to go to places that confirm their biases and they feel comfortable. It's interesting. When I grew up, again, older than many of you, the big debate in sociology in America was between our society and whether it was or should be a mixing pot versus a melting pot. And the mixing pot was the idea that regardless of where you'd come from, you would be a hyphenated American. So you could keep your identity but still be a full American. And that was the mixing pot. And you'd maybe keep local language or traditions and all that, whatever they might be, and still though share in this commonness. The melting pot was less tolerant or welcoming of these separate traditions and more of a kind of one-size-fits-all, almost homogeneity. I think now we've got a third version, neither melting pot nor mixing pot, and much more separate pots. And again, by geography, educational attainment, wealth, we become much less mobile in every sense of the word as a society, less physically mobile, less economically mobile. And so yeah, I worry about this. And again, it's one of the things that that led me to try this. It's one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about public education. It's still the principal ladder, potential ladder in our society, but it's more potential than real. I worry that the American dream has become a dream rather than a serious reality for a lot of people. I think the loss of real mobility in the society. I've never thought inequality was the issue. Let me just go on a little riff here. I apologize, Eva. People say inequality is the issue, and I said no. We've had inequality for all of our history. What's different now is not that we have people who are fabulously rich. In various ages, we've always had that. The difference is that people who are more towards the middle and bottom, their chances of getting not catching up with the fabulously rich, just being significantly better off than they are, the chances of that are less than they used to be. And that is dangerous to American democracy, because that is, again, the breeding grounds of illiberalism and populism. And I think one of the reasons it's true now is that public education is simply not good enough. Separate conversation, separate book as to why public education is as much the cause of our problems as the solution to that. So yeah, I worry about everything you just said. I mean, if de Tocqueville were to show up in America today, I think there'd be large parts of it he wouldn't recognize. I really think he would, because when de Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America 200 years ago, almost, we're coming up on that anniversary in about 10 years, he talked about how our natural inclination was to associate, and I don't think that's nearly as true. The Surgeon General this week Vivek Murthy, came out with a really interesting report. Something almost that you wouldn't imagine government would publish. It's a report about the epidemic of loneliness in America. What an interesting thing for the US government to put out. And his argument is that we've become so separate. In part, the social media is reinforcing it. We no longer have the social connections that we used to. And we're seeing it in the workplace, we're seeing it in religious institutions, we're seeing it, that community is breaking down here. And it's just really adding to problems. And if you don't know your neighbor, much easier to commit acts of violence against your neighbor. And so it's a really interesting snapshot of where we are. And this is just very different. So it's interesting. You're in the tradition, you come from Denmark. Also, often foreigners are better able at seeing us. And if you go back to de Tocqueville and Bryce, and here you are coming from Denmark, I think it's sometimes easier to see what we are. We don't see ourselves. We're almost too close to it. We're too much a part of it. But I think we've got a real problem now. And this report by the Surgeon General is quite an interesting document.
It's an excellent book that describes this
Bowling
friend of
Alone.
yours,
Yeah.
Bowling Alone,
Robert Putnam.
by Robert Putnam, that gets to that core.
He was criticized at the time, but actually we've moved more in the direction he was writing about. In some ways he was prescient.
Very, very unfortunate.
Yeah.
Ted Suter, right up front, and that's unfortunately our last question.
I apologize, I've gone on way too long on my
No,
answers. I'm a bad guest.
You
won't have me back.
It's all been interesting.
Thank you, this has been great. So recently I saw a quote from Larry Summers saying, I think he was referring to the African continent or somewhere, when China comes, we get an airport. When America comes, we get a lecture.
Yes.
And I, like many of you in the room, and I travel all over the world, and I hear the same thing. I've really sensed a change in tone over the years of people's feelings towards America and our lecturing as opposed to giving and whatnot. So I'd love to get a sense, are we moving towards, globally I'm saying, are we moving towards more tolerance for authoritarian governments, maybe benevolent dictators, more tolerance for leadership styles and cultures that America we're not okay with?
Okay, so you've got two people up here who for years were American officials. And I would hazard to say that both of us at times did our share of lecturing. But it's one thing to talk the talk when you're walking the walk, and something else to talk the talk when you're not walking the walk. So it may have been at times fairly obnoxious or annoying, but when our economy was growing gangbusters and we were making the case for what was known back then as the Washington Consensus and free trade and markets and all that, and we were performing at a high level, people may not have loved hearing it from the likes of me or Ivo or Larry Summers, but they took it. Or when our democracies seemed to, when you saw the change, one of the great advantages of democracies is not that they don't make terrible mistakes, but their ability to correct them. And so we've made our share of mistakes, God knows, but then we were able to correct them, and we were able to reform ourselves. Civil rights, cutting short certain ill-advised wars of choice, and so forth. It's much harder now to talk the talk, because in so many cases we're not walking the walk. So not only is it annoying, it's hypocritical. And so I would think the best democracy promotion thing we could do is simply show that American democracy is working and delivering. And people around the world will get up in the morning and notice it. We won't have to lecture them. They'll see it. And that's all it will take. And yeah, I mean, the other thing Larry was getting at, and, Larry I think is one of the most acute observers out there, is that we're not putting up the resources. So China's out there with some often flawed international initiatives, but they're on the field. And so we no longer have a serious trade policy in the country. We have a U.S. trade representative who's against trade. Trade used to be one of the great engines of economic growth and development around the world. We're no longer in that game. Our aid budgets haven't kept up. So yeah, I mean, there's aspects of our foreign policy that are simply not what they ought to be. Worries me a little bit given where we are in budget, because these are the kinds of things also that get slashed. They're discretionary. And you've got all your entitlements. Can't touch entitlements politically, or difficult to. Got to pay interest on the debt. Defense is where it is. Discretionary spending domestically and internationally is small now. But that's the easiest place to cut. And so I worry about where we are. So I think Larry's point is good, even though what China is often offering is really ill-advised. And countries that take it often come to regret it because of the debt trap they find themselves in, the political price they have to pay. Suddenly, well, you guys wanted this port, but now because you can't pay all your bills, you have to give us China political access, military access to this. So it's like a mortgage with a big balloon on it. But it's very hard when you're not offering an alternative. We didn't step up to the opportunity with mRNA vaccines and making them sufficiently available. Big mistake. We're going to have another opportunity in the next few years in the area of climate. Just imagine American companies are as creative as I would predict they're going to be, and we make all sorts of breakthroughs in everything from batteries to carbon capture to you name it, more efficient engines and so forth. Big question, are we going to make it widely available on terms the rest of the world can afford? I would sure hope so, but that's going to be an interesting test. We're going to need those kinds of private-public partnerships in order to make that to work. Right now, we're not there, and that's but so you can't beat something with nothing, and a lecture is either nothing or worse than nothing. So we've got to get on the field.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. However, Richard is going to be signing his books just over here. Really terrific conversation. It's worth reading the book. There's a lot more in it than you just heard here, but you got a foretaste of what's there. Please join me in thanking Richard for coming.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.